And now we're going to take a look at U.S. History Chapter 20, A Time of Social Change. In Section 1, we look at women and Native Americans fighting for change. The main idea is that in the 1960s, women and Native Americans struggled to achieve social justice. Our learning objectives are to summarize the goals of the women's liberation movement and to explain why and how Native Americans fought for change. So we start by looking at the women's liberation movement. The movement for women's rights had many different names: the women's liberation movement, the feminist movement, and the equal rights movement. A core belief of the women's liberation movement was feminism, the conviction that women and men should be socially, politically, and economically equal. Feminists cheered the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in employment. Still, fighting gender-based discrimination was given low priority. The feminine mystique. In 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique stirred up women all across the country. Friedan found that many women had everything that they could want but still felt unfulfilled. The National Organization for Women, or NOW, fought gender discrimination in the workplace, schools, and the justice system. They lobbied government. They filed lawsuits, staged rallies, and marches. Betty Friedan and Polly Murray were major figures of NOW. One critic, though, was Phyllis Schlafly. The Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, was something else that they tried to pass, and this promised equal treatment for men and women in all spheres, not just in employment. Some saw the ERA as a threat to family life. They felt it threatened the traditional role of women. This, of course, included Phyllis Schlafly and other conservatives that campaigned to defeat the ERA. The Roe v. Wade decision. This was a Supreme Court case that struck down state laws that banned abortion. And it argued that such laws violated a constitutional right to privacy. And it sparked a debate that continues to this day. Now looking at some of the successes and failures of the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement achieved many successes and failures as it fought for women's rights. In 1972, Congress passed the Educational Amendments. One of the sections, Title IX, prohibited federally funded schools from discriminating on the basis of gender in all areas, including academics and athletics. Title IX has become controversial because instead of increasing athletic opportunities for women, some colleges have used it as an excuse to cut opportunities for men. Now looking at the effects of the women's movement. The number of women holding professional jobs has increased. More women moved into senior positions in the government. More female politicians were elected to Congress. The feminist movement slowed its pace, though, in the late 1970s, and there was a perception that it only benefited wealthy white women. Now we begin to look at Native Americans in the early 1960s. As far as their living conditions, they did not share in the prosperity of the 1950s. They had the highest unemployment rates in the nation. The average income was less than half that of white American men, and they suffered disproportionately from poor health. And this brings us to the termination policy, which was a plan to draw Native Americans out of the isolated reservations and into mainstream society. The method used was to stop federal services to reservations and to relocate Native Americans to cities. The policy was a disaster. So this brings us now to a movement, or what kind of becomes known as the Red Power movement. In 1961, 700 Native Americans held a conference to oppose the termination policy. They drafted the Declaration of Indian Purpose, marking the beginning of the Red Power movement. President Johnson established the National Council on Indian Opportunity to get Native Americans more involved in setting policy regarding Indian affairs. Real change, however, came in the efforts of Native Americans, a Native American political activist. During the period of Red Power activism, Native Americans made important legislative gains. Congress passed laws that enhanced education, health care, voting rights, and religious freedom for Native Americans. Another thing that took place during this period was the occupation of Alcatraz. A group of Native Americans tried to reclaim Alcatraz Island. Now, of course, Alcatraz Island is a former prison located in the San Francisco Bay. And they claimed, the Native Americans that occupied it, claimed that the Treaty of Fort Laramie gave them the right to use any surplus federal territory. The occupation lasted for 18 months until federal marshals removed the group by force. The incident drew public attention to the plight of Native Americans. Partly as a result, New Mexico returned 48,000 acres of land to the Taos Pueblo in 1970. AIM. The American Indian Movement was founded in Minnesota in 1968, and it became the major force behind the Red Power movement. It called for a renewal of traditional cultures, economic independence, and better education for Indian children. Russell Means was one of AIM's best-known leaders. AIM sometimes used forceful tactics, such as the Trail of Broken Treaties and the occupation of Wounded Knee. Other organizations in the fight for fairness. The National Indian Education Association fought to improve access to education. Native American Rights Fund provided legal services. The Council on Energy Resource Tribes helped its member nations gain control over their natural resources and to choose whether to protect or develop them. These groups and others work to protect Native Americans' rights, improve standards of living, and do it all in a manner consistent with Native American conditions and traditions. Congress passed a number of laws in the 1970s to enhance education, healthcare, voting rights, and religious freedom for Native Americans. The Red Power movement instilled greater pride in Native Americans and generated wider appreciation of Native American culture. Despite these accomplishments, Native Americans continued to face many problems. Unemployment remained high, and the high school dropout rate among Native Americans was the highest in the nation.